we can do this any one number of ways. If you want to chime in, you can do it. Otherwise, I'll just start with another question. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So to Francis, one of the things I would ask you is, obviously you're Filipina, and recently learned myself. Was schooled in the Philippines, and learned the language and stuff. It brings up the question of language as being, perhaps as a Hispanic, I know some Spanish, but I'm not fluent in Spanish. And, when CNN called me to cover the inauguration in Spanish, I was like, probably don't want me to, you know what I mean? So how has that helped or hurt you in terms of the stories that you've been able to cover? And even if you aren't entirely fluent, which perhaps you are, how have you been able to find stories that, are from your community and about your community?
I wish I would have listened to my mother and stuck with Spanish over French when I was in high school, but you have to understand, I grew up in suburban Dallas, where everybody is blonde and wants to grow up and be a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader, and I wanted my last name instead of Rivera to be Rivers or Riviera, so it didn't sound so ethnic. That's where I grew up in the 80s, in again, very white suburban Dallas. And because of that, I kind of wanted to do the anti-Latin Hispanic thing because, do people think I'm Mexican? They certainly don't think I'm Filipino because they don't even know where the Philippines are.
Right.
So at that time I shunned it, and now I so regret it. I'm kicking myself because how many times have you been taken, or you've been at a press conference, or you've been at a scene where there are Spanish speakers, or you would get interviews and you're Spanish speaking. For me, I would have loved in the past when we're taking live news conferences from the anchor desk, and all of a sudden somebody speaks in Spanish, I have to break away saying, okay, we'll get an interpreter. But when I see Natalie Morales or some of these other people on the network level who do speak Spanish, or even Rick Sanchez, and they can interpret it right then and there. I'm like, how cool is that?
Yeah.
It just, number one, it gives you that extra dimension of being able to cover that. And again, there are some times when you go to a crime scene or you go somewhere where if you're speaking Spanish, then that person may feel a little bit more comfortable in chatting with you too, versus, alien, white or Asian person who doesn't speak that language. And the same applies to Vietnamese, to Chinese, to Filipino, and Spanish and other languages as well. So I say if you have that as a second language, milk it, milk it, milk it. Especially, not if you want to delve into the broadcast industry, but in any field at all, milk it, milk it, milk it.
That's a really good point. Absolutely.
I'm just curious, why did you decide to study in the University of Philippines?
I had no choice. My mother made me because she thought I was too American. So she shipped me off, and it was the best thing she could have ever done. So it was spectacular. I hated it. I didn't understand Filipino, and I am this Asian-looking Filipino girl, but I have this American twang, and I fought it, but it helped me embrace and grasp who I am and my Filipino-ness, so that now, I look back and I think of why the hell was I embarrassed that my last name was Rivera and wanted to tone down my ethnicity, whereas now it's we live in a world that's you got a little bit of mixed something,
right?
It's like play it up, play it up.
But to your point, though, I think, and I'll speak from the same perspective. I took 4 years of Spanish, but I also took 5 years of French basically in high school, and really didn't want to focus on my Spanish because I really wasn't proud of being a Haitian Dominican person at the time. I was having issues with my dad's side of the family and all this other kind of garbage. And my mother, who's actually here today in the back, told me the same thing your mom told you. She's back here. She's a good egg. And she said the same thing. And I really think that it's one of the things that personally we weren't exposed at that level. At a younger age, it wasn't cool. We saw Christy Turlington and we saw Cindy Crawford, and they looked ethnic to us compared to Kate Moss. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so, in any case, I think that a lot has changed in terms of the media. And another point is that there's a lot of ethnic media out there, like Vietnamese radio stations in the language, or Spanish radio stations, or newspapers, and those kinds of things. So there's always an opportunity to work perhaps for a bit of a smaller outlet, not just in your language, if perhaps it's your primary language, or something else that you want to use as then a launch pad to get some journalism experience and then transfer to quote unquote more traditional media. Okay, now Randolph, you edit over at New England Cable News and take a lot of the feeds and whatnot, and also are very involved in sports and everything. How do you feel the editing process affects what somebody actually gets as their information on, at the end of the day, and when they're sitting in their living room? And how do you perhaps have any kind of a perspective or influence on that, being, a minority?
Good question. I mean, I don't think too much about it as I'm doing my job. I just do my job. I mean, I listened to Latoya's example about the shooting of the 6-month-old. That was actually close to where I live.
Right.
You know, so I always pay attention to those stories. So, you know, when I lived in Mattapan, when I hear these things, I would somewhat take it personally.
Sure.
You know, it would affect me. So I would definitely follow these things. I didn't really have a voice in the newsroom. I'm not literally in it. I'm next to it as an editor. I'm just supposed to edit my video, or if I'm doing E&G receive, I just take in the feeds, turn it around, and shoot it out. You know, so.
So it's, yeah, I mean, in that perspective, I guess that can sort of be, you know, you have to work with what you're given, as opposed to being sort of that point of decision making where Latoya can go out and say this is really more the story. But one of the other things that you do that I think is interesting, and a lot more people are doing this, and perhaps some of you in the audience are doing this as well, is, you know, blogging, and we were talking about this earlier, becoming your own brand. In this changing face of media nowadays, there's just so much going on, and there's so many outlets, and yet there are fewer jobs, but there's also more creation online and whatnot. How and why have you found that to be effective, and does your ethnicity play into it at all in any way? And if not, just maybe perhaps talk a little bit about new media and the foray into blogging and establishing your own website and how that is working for you.
Well, getting to the ethnicity of it, I find it interesting because a while ago I wrote a story, had a friend of mine at work read it. You know, he's one of the few black people at NECN. And, you know, he read it, he came back to me, he's like, hey, Randolph, yo, you said, you know, something like this way. You sounding black. I'm like, yeah. I don't want to be like everybody else. I know who I am. I like you know, the person I am. I like my character. I like, you know, just hanging loose, speaking the way I want to. I don't want to fit in because I don't necessarily fit into what the standard is. So I feel with the whole online angle, you know, people have a lot more freedom to be themselves and express themselves the way they want to express themselves, as opposed to, you know, joining a large organization that would pretty much dictate to you how you're supposed to sound, how you're supposed to say things, how you're supposed to look, and stuff like that. So,
plus, Randolph, as I think about, because are you blogging about sports?
Yeah.
Okay. Think about this for the fans of ESPN or things like that. Think about, what's his name? Stuart Scott. Scott, we were talking about this. Stuart Scott he made a brand for himself, and everybody is copying it. The whitest white man now says
booyah,
and all of those quote-unquote ethnic ghetto terms, because it's more interesting when you see the sports clips to add a little splash of, I don't know, is it ghetto? I mean, what is it really? That he's
slang.
Booyah, slang.
Yeah.
So
it's cool.
You know, yeah. So it's now cool to have a little spice in just instead of a generic sports broadcast delivery. So, you know, it's good for you to add your little extra flavor in there. I mean, it works. You know, Francis, you talked about trying to drop Francis Rivera and making it to Rivers. I know, Francesca, we know each other back from, I think your first job was Binghamton, my first job was Binghamton too.
Yep.
And we always worry, especially in TV broadcasting, you always worry about, well, what's my TV name going to be? Especially when you first set out, you're like, what is my name? My name's Latoya Simone. My maiden name is Foster than Edwards. And I remember being at Emerson, and the big professor at the time was like, oh, you cannot say Latoya. That cannot be your name. That is just too ethnic. So I said, you should use your middle name, Simone, which is a beautiful name, and I do love it. So I sent out all of these resume tapes, Simone Foster. And I got a call back on my first job in Binghamton. I got a call on my graduation day. And so we were talking, and I had little brothers and sisters at the time, and the news director ended up calling me saying, can I speak to Simone? And my little sister was like, there's no Simone here. and then I think he wants Toya. And so I get on the phone, and he says, what is your name? And I told him my name was Latoya, and he said, that's your TV name. Use your name, Latoya. Every job that I've gone to, every news director has wanted me to be Latoya because they don't want a black female who happens to sound like be named Jane Smith. They want Latoya Shaniqua Jackson Jones. They want the blackest of the black. You know, they want to prove that they have ethnicity. So it's nothing to shy away from.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I think that's a good point. Go ahead.
I have a scenario. I'm not. I was fortunate. I'm